So I wanted to share with you, as Christian said, a little bit about our context, a little bit about what has been happening in our corner of the world, and share how God has been showing up. So I think I have been trying throughout my life, I'm a cradle Episcopalian, I grew up in the church, to follow God, to follow God's mission. But what I want to do is start my story today with a man named Emmanuel. So can I click this? Will this take me to my presentation?
Yes.
Let's see.
Did I turn it off?
No? Oh, there we go. So, and I love that Steph was saying how to say yes to God's mission, because that's basically what I was thinking about and about so much of my story. So, like I said, this part of my story starts on, I don't think I'm doing this right. Am I pressing this button? There we go.
Yeah.
Yep, perfect. There we go. So this part of my story starts with a man named Emmanuel. This is Emmanuel. And I was the priest in charge of an inner city church in Dayton, Ohio. And one day there was a knock on the door. And there was this man standing on the doorstep. And I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know who he was. But for some reason I felt compelled to open the door and invite him in. And he introduced himself and proceeded to tell me his story. He had lived through the genocide in Rwanda and had found a home in a refugee camp in Togo in Africa, and then had found his way to the United States, standing on the doorstep, knocking on the door of the local Episcopal church. And he asked me if that church could be his church. And I said, of course. And pretty soon he was bringing people with him, people from his family and his community. Other Rwandan and Burundian immigrants to this country began to come. And one day he said to me, you know, in Africa, the pastors go to people's homes and visit them there. And I said, yeah, I know, but I'm kind of scared to just go knock on strangers' doors. And he said, well, I'll take you. And he did. He drove me around and took me into the neighborhood. We would get out on street corners, and he would take me to the place that a group of men had declared their gathering spot and introduce me to people. And he took me into people's living rooms, and he said, let me tell you their story. And he would translate as they shared their story with me. I went to birthday parties and weddings, fundraisers, and family dinners. And one day he came to me and he said, you know, we love you and we love this church, but we miss singing songs in our own language. And so we tried to make space for a Rwandan choir to sing on Sunday mornings, but it always kind of felt like a performance piece. So a little later he came to me and he said, do you think we could start a prayer fellowship? I said, I have no idea what that is, but yes. If you teach me, we can do this. And so we began humbly at first, just a couple of speakers and a few instruments, and a small group of people praying and singing in Kinyarwanda, the native language of Rwanda. Eventually I left St. Andrews, but Emmanuel continued to gather people. Here they are a few weeks ago, filling that little church with both people and the Spirit. Opening the door that afternoon opened my heart and propelled me into a new way of life. Emmanuel taught me that God doesn't wait for us to notice what's happening around us. God breaks in, as Stephanie said. God is already moving, building community, planting ideas in people's hearts and minds, introducing strangers to one another, inviting us constantly to newness. It's our job to say yes to God's invitation and move out into the community and join in. So at the same time I was hanging out with Emmanuel, I was also spending a lot of time with young adults who were saying very similar things. We love God and we love Jesus and we love the church, but we wish we could sing different music, or that someone would ask us our opinion, or that we could be part of creating something together. And so I did this crazy thing. I asked my bishop if I could start a new community in our diocese. I wrote a letter with a proposal of sorts. He was a new bishop, and I didn't really know him all that well. And I didn't have any experience or knowledge about what I was proposing to do. But I said, what if I did this? What if I went and started a community? And he said yes. Except that instead of planting one community, what if you plant several? What if we start a movement of new missional communities in our diocese? Well, I didn't know how to do that either, but I started anyway. I went and I learned from the only people that I knew who were doing these kinds of things. I talked to Karen Ward, and I went and visited Steph, and they introduced me to people in England who were working on these things for a while. A movement called Fresh Expressions of Church, who had produced a report called Mission-Shaped Church, a place where the imagination of the church could be unleashed, describing all the various ways that church could happen. And it was literally like a whole new world opened up for me. Like any person who begins this kind of journey, I read every book I could get my hands on, and I, like Alice in Wonderland, fell down rabbit holes of blogs that I didn't know existed, and I attended my fair share of emergent church conferences. But then it hit me. Reading and listening to people talk about this stuff actually didn't help. We had to start experimenting and practicing and trying things. And luckily, there were a few little communities that had begun to do this in our diocese. So I went and I met with them, and we started gathering and talking and dreaming together. And so I just started right where I was. With a few friends, we started meeting weekly for a house church. We met and we would talk and pray and dream about what we might do in our neighborhood together. Here's that community, I don't even know if you can see the image very well, but here's that community gathered to baptize 2 little girls on Easter morning a few years ago at our local park. So as we began to dream, I think we were longing for a new yet ancient way of sharing life together. Part of the work of what we have called praxis communities, these communities that have emerged out of this movement, has been encouraging and planting intentional communities, places where people can live together, whether in a single home or a network of homes in a neighborhood, who share meals and a common rhythm and maybe a shared intention for their neighborhood. These communities are places where we try to live out God's dream for humanity and seek the kingdom through acts of justice and love and mercy. We try to live simply and deeply in the neighborhoods we call home. So I could probably spend all afternoon telling you stories of these communities, but I'm going to give you the 5-second tour. I would be more than happy to share with anyone in more detail about any one of these communities that spark your imagination, and you can go on our blog at praxiscommunities.org and find their stories in more detail. But we began by starting a diocesan intentional community program that we call Brendan's Crossing. And a few months later, we started an Episcopal Service Corps program called Confluence Year in Columbus and another city in Ohio. And then we began a Catholic worker-style house of hospitality for homeless women and children. And then we have a bike co-op and a community garden and a group of people living in several homes in a neighborhood called Franklinton outside of Columbus. We've been helping to get a community called Tikkun Farms started because we believe that food and faith and healing are interconnected. And we had a woman who graduated from our ESC program who's just started a community called the Near East House. And they have just received one of the UTO young adult grants to start a community garden that's going to engage with and employ youth in their neighborhood for that garden. So beyond our intentional communities, we've also started some new worshiping communities. I told you a little bit about New Hope African Fellowship. But we've started a community called Northside Abbey, inspired by my friend Bob Leopold at Southside Abbey. Northside Abbey considers themselves a bunch of urban artist mystics, finding ways to connect art and contemplative practices So we there were meeting in a park, praying and singing right in the middle of the community. And we have another community called St. Matthew's, which I just have to tell you about. St. Matthew's was a traditional church. It was a church plant actually in our diocese, and they sold their building. And they moved literally onto Main Street. Here they are in a house that they now inhabit, and they worship on Sunday mornings in the upper room of an Irish pub down the street from this house. But they have literally moved into the neighborhood. We also have a series of what we call in our praxis communities as arts communities. So one of those is called Art as a Spiritual Connection. And they gather children and adults for camps and workshops and retreats using art in a whole variety of spiritual practices. We also started something called the Ease Gallery, Episcopal art space for everyone. There was an not abandoned, the church is very vibrant, but there was kind of an empty room or space in this church. And they began talking, it was right on Ohio State's campus, and they found ways to support art students and faculty and community art organizations. And this has become a gathering space for people who would never have set foot in that church otherwise. We also believe that all of our campus ministries, which we can include as part of our praxis communities, are emerging communities of faith and places where experimentation and improvisation and in fact are mission centers for our churches. And like many of you, we've engaged in pub theology in all of its many forms. So we've done things like beer and hymn events, we've had dinner church, we've had Flash Compline, where we just show up and pray in a local park or downtown. Ways that we can practice being the church outside of the walls, embedded in our communities, praying and singing and theologizing in public places. All of these expressions of church fall outside the traditional mold. And our communities, that's how we describe our praxis communities, are communities of faith and practice. Places where we're learning how to gather people, how to engage in acts of love and service, and explore what discipleship means on the most practical level. How can we walk in the way of Jesus, where we live, with the passion and gifts that God has given us? And how can we offer support and encouragement to all who are engaging mission in their own context? So what I want to say to you today is that networks matter. Communities of mutual support and collaboration build sustainability. That we know firsthand that supporting a new church, a new worshiping community, a new expression of God in the community is really hard work, and it's harder if you have to do it alone. Being a mission outpost of the church is hard. And in fact, I believe that as Episcopalians, we know this better than anyone, and that's why we created the original network. We have dioceses, ways in which we connect people who are doing this work together, and to say this group of churches, they work together to support the mission of God in this particular geographic place. And that's what we hoped praxis communities might be in Southern Ohio. To connect emerging communities, experimenting with creative ideas, and still remain connected to the established church. We believe that change would come through that place of connection. I believe that forming networks is the single most important way we can further God's missional work. Networks foster collaboration, not competition. Networks are adaptive. They have the ability to form and reform, to respond to changing realities in a way that institutions just can't. Networks also have the ability to listen to those on the margins, and in doing so, support shared power and shared learning. We believe that knowledge exists everywhere. And so I want to share with you, as a way of kind of closing this up, what we've learned. We agreed that because these communities that we have are so diverse, there was no way to say this is what we are and this is what we believe. But what we wanted to do was to say these are the practices we share, this is who we are. And so, very, very briefly, the tenets that we have come to claim for ourselves are to know people by name. This sounds obvious, but it's really about being relational. It's about knowing people's stories, inviting people to become friends and fellow practitioners, to listen to voices on the margins, to connect with people we don't yet know, and to really learn each other's stories. We also believe that we are called to give permission. This does not mean that the people on the top tell the people on the bottom they have permission to do this. What it means is my crazy idea inspires your crazy idea. So that's what we're about. We're about saying yes and blessing people and saying, what you're doing sounds beautiful, how can I help? We also talk about respecting the seasons. For me, this is about not taking on the burden of perpetuity. We want to create things that are going to last forever, except sometimes they don't, and then we think it's a failure. And what we've said is those things aren't failures. Sometimes we grow food to feed us this season, and we're not going to need that food next season. So we plant seeds and we harvest them, and sometimes the ground lays fallow after that. And sometimes someone else picks up those seeds and plants them somewhere else. And we say that's what God does. That's how God works in us, and it's our job to not let our ego get in front of what God's up to. Another one of our tenets is to accept the beautiful mess, to know that, as Stephanie said, sometimes this feels real messy and really chaotic. And we believe that half-finished projects and gardens full of weeds and awkward moments in worship are all holy. And that messes are the way that God moves over us and the way the Spirit is moving in us and in our communities. And the final one is to participate in the church beyond our church. This is our shorthand way of saying, learn from others. You are not the only one doing this. Recognize and participate and engage in practices that belong to other communities. This is our way of saying God is out ahead of us, and it's our job to join in and not think we have to create everything. And when we experience something beautiful and transformative in someone else's community, we come back to our core communities and tell them about it. So I just want to say that God is out ahead of us. Will you say yes? Will you join in? I want to say go. Go into the neighborhood. Join with people. Engage in what God is up to. Don't be afraid. Experiment, say yes, seek collaborators, find ways to look for possibility that others haven't seen yet. And one of our final things that we believe is kind of underlying everything we've done is to play. I think we try to have fun, we try to laugh, we try to make fun of ourselves and the ways that we have done this. We try to just enjoy what we're doing. And we've learned so much from improv and from jazz, and we love the idea of improvising new music and new ideas and new ways of being church. And one of improv's most core tenets, many of you know this, is to say yes and then add your own contribution or gift. So for me, saying yes to mission, being a missional voice, is no more and no less than saying yes and. Thanks.
Want this back?